Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to find out the real minimum requirement to play Stellar Blade. A quick recap on the proposed minimum requirement is the i5 7600K or the Ryzen 5 1600X, 16GB of RAM, GTX 1066GB variant, or the AMD Radeon RX 588GB variant, and no mentioning of any Intel Arc GPU. Also, this is at 1080p. We're going to start 1080p, the preset at low to get a target of 60 FPS. In my opinion, if you're on a budget, you won't mind go a bit lower than 60, but for sure higher than 30. Welcome to Response PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. I always start with Intel and Nvidia for testing the real minimum requirements. So this time we're starting with the AMD. So starting off with the lowest Ryzen series, the Ryzen 3 1200, still at 16GB of RAM because it seems to need always more than 8, and the RX 560 4GB variant. We're playing at 1080p, lowest settings, and FSR balance to get an average of 36 FPS. Remember, we're on a budget and we want just over 30 FPS or higher. Now I said this is deemed playable. You can even turn off some other system, or if you want, I won't say it's a good idea, but drop a FSR balance to performance. But even at balance, you can feel the blurriness of upscaling. Next up, we have the RX 480. I want to drop one generation to see how it goes. I know it should be more powerful than the RX 560, but who knows with the DX12 what is include and not include in this game. I'm going to keep the Ryzen 3 1200 until I find the lowest AMD GPU can play this game at over 30 FPS. So we're still at 1080p, lowest settings, and FSR balance. But this time we get 52 FPS and no crash and no warning or error message. So RX 400 series can play this game, at least the 480. But it seems the CPU is compensating for something the RX 560 had and the RX 480 doesn't have, because now the CPU is a bottleneck, or almost. We're at 96% of utilization on the CPU, while the GPU is in the high 60 to mid 70. But the CPU utilization on the RX 560 was at the mid 60, and the GPU was pegged at 99% of utilization. Lowering the bar a little bit more, the RX 470 4GB variant, theoretically we should be same or more powerful than the RX 560 at 1080p low settings, but at 1080p low settings with FSR Ultra performance, I'm not even able to reach 30 FPS. We are 26 FPS. GPU is pegged at 99%, and the CPU is back to the mid 50s to mid 60s percentage of utilization. I'm not sure here why the CPU utilization is inconsistent between GPUs. I was expecting the RX 570 to also have a bottleneck through the CPU, but it seems it's underperformed so much that the CPU is even waiting for it. And just for the fun of it, I've decided to also try an old AMD R9 380 4GB variant. And surprisingly enough, at 1080p, lowest settings, and FSR balance, we're getting a stable 38 FPS. With the GPU pegged at 99%, obviously, using all 4GB of VRAM available, and the CPU was in the mid 70 to the mid 80. So surprisingly enough, this should be playable. I wasn't expecting to be able to play on the R9, but now you can. Now, just for the fun of it and to try it and check some core/thread performance, the Ryzen 3 1200 is a 4-core 4-thread. I decided to try the old FX 6300. This is a 6-core 6-thread. Theoretically, the Ryzen 3 is a bit more performance, but lower core than the FX 6300. Also lower gigahertz, 3.1 versus 3.5. We're still at 1080p in lowest settings and FSR balance, but this time the R9 380 that I kept in that system giving us 48 FPS average. That means the Ryzen 3 1200 was giving us some CPU bottleneck. I've also tried the RX 480 on the FX 6300, and we have over 60 FPS with FSR balance, obviously. So it seems that you'll need at least a 6-core 6-thread CPU to not be bottleneck at any point in the game, because now I'm still early in game. That also means we find our minimum requirement for the CPU side, also for the GPU, because I don't really have a lower 4GB VRAM card than the R9 380. Switching to Intel CPU and Nvidia GPU. For the real minimum requirement, starting off, I dropped the CPU to the i3 3770, and for the GPU I dropped to the GTX 1050 Ti. That's a 4GB VRAM card. I won't go lower than 4GB or 3GB, otherwise it's deemed unplayable. And since we saw also on the AMD side that we need at least 6-core, 6-thread to be deemed playable, otherwise we get CPU bottleneck with a 4-core, and at 1080p lowest settings and FSR quality, you get an average of 50 FPS. If you want more FPS, you can even drop it to FSR balance, but less blurry the better. And 50 FPS is playable enough to not have to drop the visual quality. And we have the behavior that we're looking for our hardware. GPU is back at 99%, using 3.7 out of 4GB of VRAM. CPU is in the high 40 to mid 50s % of utilization, and the RAM we're a bit high at 15.2GB of RAM out of 16. So maybe we have a little RAM bottleneck, maybe sticking more because the remaining is for Windows. And I'm sure I'm not in a high demanding area, may need more RAM depending on the area. Now going down in generation, the GTX at 970, so down in generation but up in performance. Even though we have a 3.5GB of VRAM plus 512 of slower RAM, VRAM, we get way higher FPS with 1080p, lowest settings, FSR quality, and we get an average of 66 FPS. I wasn't expecting to be that higher. I know it was going to be higher, but that higher, this is more than playable. Way over 60 FPS. This is more than the minimum requirement. Yes, we have FSR enabled, but still, we are higher than 60 FPS. And the GPU is not even pegged at 100%. We're hovering between 96 to 98% of utilization. CPU is still in the acceptable 60% of utilization. And for the RAM, we are at 14. And finally, the lowest NVIDIA you can go, the GTX 960 4GB variant. You'll know why in a couple seconds or minutes. First off, the GTX 960 4GB variant is pegged at 96 to 98% of utilization. I don't know why it's not pegged at 100. Using 3.989GB of VRAM out of 4, CPU utilization is in the mid 50s and RAM in the 13GB of RAM to give us an average of 45 FPS at 1080p, lowest settings and FSR quality. And that will be our lowest GPU you can go to play Stellar Blade. Just for the purpose to show you guys the GTX 780 or 780 Ti or whatever 700 series. When you start the game will launch, but you get the EU Unreal Engine error, fatal error, then ask you to send a report or blah 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 blah. So you cannot go lower than the 900 series of the GTX, and you'll need at least a 4GB variant card on top of that. You may have the GTX 750 Ti 4GB variant, which I don't have, which also had a longer support than all the other 700 series. So we know the lowest on NVIDIA will be the GTX 960, but the CPU, the i3 3770, seems to be more than enough. So it's time to drop the CPU to the i7 920, my oldest more than 4-core 4-thread CPU I have. And since the game seems to like only how many core you have, 6 or more, and not giving a damn on how old are those core, this i7 first gen is the perfect core / age. You can play this game. Paired with the lowest GPU, the GTX 960 at 1080p, lowest settings and FSR quality, we get an average of 43 FPS. GPU peg at 99% using the entire VRAM available, and the CPU in the 60 to 70% of utilization. So there's even still room for the CPU to do other tasks. So that's all for the real minimum requirement to play Stellar Blade. You will need FSR on quality or balance to be able to play properly. I do not recommend to drop to performance or lower. It will be ugly and blurry. The 16GB is absolutely needed, and apparently as long as you have a 6-core 6-thread or higher for the CPU, you're in business. And for the GPU, if you have a 4GB VRAM and some model won't be able to play properly, like the RX 470. But for this video and testing, the CPU was FX 6300 on the AMD side, the i7 920 on the Intel side, 16GB of RAM non-negotiable, and the GPU, the GTX 960 4GB variant, the R9 380 4GB variant, and I didn't test in this video, but the Intel Arc A310, which you can see on my Intel Arc video on Stellar Blade. So those are the winner for the real minimum requirement to play Stellar Blade at 1080p. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one, and subscribe.